Podcast Spainsif, plataforma de referencia de la inversión sostenible en España. Welcome to Podcast Spainsif, the reference platform for the promotion of sustainable investment in Spain. Today, we have the chance to talk with Beth Burks, Associate Director for Sustainable Finance in Corporate and Infrastructure Ratings for S&P Global and Water Specialist, as a part of our podcast series devoted to sustainable investment in water. Welcome to this podcast, Beth, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and welcome to the audience.
So, Beth, let's begin. I would like to begin questioning how are water-related risks impacting credit ratings?
Hi, thanks for your question. So I want to start by saying there was a change in the regulation around credit ratings from March 30th this year by the European Securities and Market Authority, ESMA. So they put in place a disclosure requirement for our credit ratings to flag when environmental, social, or governance factors, which is the so-called ESG, have impacted our credit opinions. So that's a new regulation that's come into place, which will help increase transparency of risks relating to ESG in our credit ratings. But prior to that, we've been doing our own reports and releases to highlight when these risks have impacted ratings. So at the end of 2018, we published a report specifically on water risks and how they've impacted credit. So water is kind of only a part of the environmental factors that we consider as part of the ratings analysis, but it's an important part. So in fact, almost a third of our ratings that featured environmental factors over a 2-year period were to do with water. So water risk events like droughts and floods were the most likely to drive a rating action. Of those rating actions, almost 70% of them were negative. So either a downgrade or a placement on credit watch with a negative outlook, for example. So water has the opportunity to really, drive down ratings really when you have droughts and floods. So that's, quite an obvious statement really. But what's interesting about this report is that we found that water didn't just affect sectors with large water usage like utilities, but it also in fact affected sectors where consumer behavior is often determined by the weather. So here you see the link between climate and water. So we saw it in retail and restaurants, etc. We also saw that water risks can occur in the supply chains of issuers, and that can influence their ratings. So there was 2 examples that we highlighted in that report. One was in 2011 when floods impacted cotton production in Pakistan. We took rating actions on garment producers and even retailers in countries outside of Pakistan. And another example is in 2017, Brazil had a drought which impacted the sugarcane production. And so the sugarcane processor, Jales Machado, stopped its factories because of the bad harvest, and that led to rating actions. So we know that water can impact credit ratings, and it does, and it's quite significant in terms of the environmental factors that we consider as part of the ratings. And often, when these events happen, the rating action is negative.
And Beth, what kind of indicators does the Standard & Poor's ratings use to track the appetite for water-related investments?
Yeah, sure. So water-related investments is quite a broad term. There's alongside the sort of more obvious issuance from water utilities, which is obviously a water-related investment, we closely track the sustainable debt market. So the sustainable debt market includes a number of financial instruments like the green bonds, green loans, social bonds, sustainability-linked instruments. So there's a number of different mechanisms that issuers can use to raise sustainable debt from the markets. And it gives us a good understanding of the appetite for sustainable finance overall from investors and from issuers. And what's important to note is it's been growing rapidly over the last 5 years. So in 2019, last year, it doubled in size compared to 2018. And this year, we're forecasting that there's going to be another 400 billion in issuance in this sustainable debt market. That takes the total market of sustainable debt to around 1% of the total, from 1% of the total debt capital markets in 2015 to around 3.5% today. So we're looking at growth. It's still relatively small compared to the total debt capital markets, but it's growing really rapidly. It's mostly dominated by green bonds, and water-related investment projects feature just in about a small amount of this issuance, about 2 to 3% annually. But that's been rising from about 1% a few years ago. So there's still a massive opportunity for growth in the space for water-related investments. And I think a lot of the times it's challenging with water projects because they tend to be small and local. So often when I speak on other panels around water with banks, you tend to see that their water-related investments are in their loan markets rather than in the bond market. So that could be a reason for why we're not seeing such a huge proportion dedicated to water. The other thing that we use to track it, which is more of an S&P related aspect, we have two analytical products that are not credit ratings, but score issuances on their environmental benefits or issuers on their ESG performance. So the one that we use for issuances, where we look at the environmental benefits of the projects that are used, that issuance is used to finance, is our green evaluation product. And that scores the contribution to adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and of course incorporates water-related investments. So we've had quite good interest from this product from water-related investment opportunities, and we've actually scored transactions related to water projects from 3 different continents. The second product that we have, which looks at the issuers and their ESG performance, is the ESG evaluation. This is a relatively new product for S&P ratings. We only launched it last year. We've got 9 public ESG evaluations, and 2 of those 9 are actually related to water, including our best score to date, which is American Water, which has a score of 87 out of 100, where 100 is the top range of our scoring system for ESG performance. And part of the rationale that drives such a high score for American Water was actually to do with their ability to do climate scenario analysis to assess the resilience of their infrastructure. So typically, we say for water utilities, ESG is sort of business as usual. And a lot of these utilities are very sort of advanced in their scenario analysis and their ability to assess the impacts of climate change on the resilience of their infrastructure. So it's a fairly interesting space, and another indicator of the growing appetite amongst investors for this kind of information, and the issuers for putting out, showcasing the environmental benefits associated with water sustainable debt.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned before green bonds, and I was thinking, with respect to climate change and water, what work is Standard & Poor's Ratings doing to provide information to investors at the moment?
Yeah, so we have those 2 products, the green evaluation and the ESG evaluation that I mentioned, which really give another perspective to investors, other than whether or not these issuers and issuances are likely to pay their interest rates and meet their debt obligations. So these products are sort of really focused on providing alternative data to investors around environmental issues and climate change. So those are 2 of the aspects that we're doing. But alongside that, we recognize that there's an important link between climate change and water risks, and we're really passionate about providing high quality information for investors based on the expertise that we have in credit. So recently, we've published reports that use climate scenarios to uncover potential for floods to impact residential mortgage-backed securities in the UK. And we have another study that uses data derived from satellites to look at the link between the locations of US public water utilities and their credit quality. So in the first study that looks at mortgage-backed securities and flood risk in the UK, we showed that most of the collateral contained in these structured finance bonds that we rate are located in low risk of flooding in the UK. So around 0.2% are currently in high risk areas. But if we look out 20 years from now, the climate change scenarios from the UK's Met Office suggest that these collateral pools, if they remain in the same locations, by 2040, that percentage rises from 0.2% to almost 15%. So that's quite a significant increase and over quite a relatively short space of time. There are, of course, management techniques available to prevent this kind of risk exposure impacting credit quality, so flood risk protections, reinsurance, that sort of thing. But it's important that we continue to kind of do scenarios analysis work around climate change on our own credits that we rate to stay ahead of these risks and to ensure that we're asking the right questions of issuers and management teams to ensure that these risks to do with climate change that we know are coming are well mitigated. So that second study I mentioned, which looked at US public water utilities and used satellite data, we found that water utilities located near snow-capped mountains and evergreen forest had higher all-in coverage ratios, which is all-in coverage ratio is the financial indicator that we use to rate public water utilities in the US. So the study used satellite data, as I mentioned, but also machine learning to uncover these links. From a scientific perspective, we know that evergreen forests promote better water quality and that snow-capped mountains act as a natural reservoir for storing water. So the results of the study felt intuitive. But what's interesting about this is we know climate change is going to impact these ecosystems as wildfires, droughts, rising temperatures, etc., reduce the ability of these ecosystems to support the provision of water. So we're assessing, again, how management are factoring these risks into their plans for the future. And really, I personally find water to be a very analytically interesting area because the problems caused by climate change are really impacting these, the availability and the quality of water that we'll have in the future. So there's a lot that we're doing in the space to try and highlight these risks and to ensure that S&P ratings have the right questions to ask of management teams and issuers to ensure that we're factoring in correctly the appropriate level of risk into our ratings.
Well, it's very clear why this growing interest is happening based on the data. But at the moment, are Standard & Poor rating clients demanding this kind of information increasingly, more now than in the past years, for instance?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a rise in requests for this kind of information. Our readership figures for our ESG-related research are consistently amongst the top red for the last year. So we know that our audience for our research is really interested in everything ESG, particularly climate related. We also hear from investors that they've been asked by their clients for more information on ESG in general, and that any issues that their clients are really passionate about. So this is driving demand across the investment cycle for better information and analysis. I think the regulation that I mentioned at the start of this interview around ESMA asking for ESG disclosures in credit for us to highlight when ESG has factored into the credit rating is just another example of the market really demanding this kind of information. And that those changes have happened over the last 5 years, really. So it's an interesting time to work in water and on water-related investments. And I really feel that this trend is here, it's structural, it's here to stay because of issues like climate change. And if we think on the social side of ESG, COVID-19 is obviously a topic that we're commenting on and researching for ESG as well, and putting out a lot of research around that. So I think, ESG in general, but water particularly, and the links to climate are something that, the investment community is demanding really high quality information on, because from that study that I mentioned that we did in 2018 on the impacts on credit, we know it can drive credit rating actions, and they tend to be negative when these things occur. So it's really important that investors, credit analysts, and clients of investors really stay on top of these risks.
Mm-hmm. Beth, thank you so much for all this information, for all these insights, and for joining this special podcast series on water and sustainable investment. It was a pleasure having such an in-depth view on what's happening at the moment on water-related risks in credit ratings as an important environmental factor for the kind of indicators that are more commonly used for water-related investments, as well as the kind of information that's provided to investors with respect to this. So thank you very much, Beth. And as for the audience, thank you for listening, and let's meet again in another podcast of Spainsif.
Podcast Spainsif, plataforma de referencia de la inversión sostenible en España.